"You're off the manifest, Adler." Staff Sergeant Wade Corbin said it loud enough for the whole motor pool to hear, and that was the point. He didn't lower the clipboard. He didn't look at her like a person. He looked at her the way a man looks at a chair he's about to move out of his way. "We're going up the Safid corridor at 04. That's a shooter's run, not a clinic. You'll stay here and keep the cots warm in case one of my guys stubs a toe." A couple of his guys laughed. The young ones always laughed first, because laughing was how they told him they belonged to him. Cold mountain wind came down off the ridge and pushed grit across the gravel, and somewhere a generator coughed and caught. Maren Adler did not move. She was 5'4" in her boots, and she stood the way she always stood, weight even, hands loose, shoulders quiet. Her eyes went to the clipboard, then to the corridor on the wall map behind him, then to a single point past his shoulder, where the valley narrowed to a throat of rock at about 700 meters. Her hands did not curl. Her jaw did not set. She did not say the thing a louder person would have said. She breathed out slow, once, the way she'd been taught, and she let the insult pass through her like wind through a fence. Because here is what Corbin didn't know. He didn't know what was in her file, the one nobody at this outpost had bothered to read. He didn't know the corridor he was about to drive into had a wind problem he hadn't measured and a high shelf he hadn't counted. He didn't know that the quietest person in that motor pool had already done the math on the exact patch of ground that was going to try to kill him. She already knew something they would spend the rest of that night trying to forget. If you're new here, do me one favor before we go further. Subscribe and drop your city in the comments, because I genuinely love seeing how far these stories travel. And stay with me all the way to the end, because there is a moment coming, late, in the dark, where the loudest man on this base has to key a radio and say this woman's name like it's the only thing left holding him together. You'll know it when you hear it. Now let's go back. Combat outpost. Safid sat at 9,000 feet in a country that did not want anyone living there. The air was thin enough that new arrivals spent a week dizzy. At night, the temperature fell through the floor, and the rocks ticked as they cooled. By day, the dust got into everything: your teeth, your weapon, the seams of your eyes. The outpost was a horseshoe of HESCO barriers and plywood bee huts wrapped around a landing zone. And above it, on every side, the mountains stood up gray and indifferent, watching, the way mountains do. Myron had been there 11 weeks. To the men of Corbin's section, she was the small woman with the aid bag, the medic they'd been assigned, the one who didn't talk. What they did not bother to learn was that before the aid bag, there had been a rifle. 2 deployments as a scout sniper, top of her class at the schoolhouse, a class of 38 men and her, a confirmed cold bore record that instructors still quoted, then a cross-training pipeline that put a combat medic's hands on the same arms that could put a round through a doorway at distance. She had carried the rifle and the aid bag both, in places these men had only read about, and she had stopped explaining herself a long time ago, because explaining yourself to people who've already decided is just noise you make before they ignore you. She carried one voice with her instead: Gunny Pruitt, the man who'd taught her to shoot, a leathery old recon Marine with a voice like gravel in a coffee can. He'd been gone 3 years now, but he was louder in her head than anyone alive. He used to stand behind her on the line, hand on her shoulder, and say the same thing every time. Slow, like a prayer he'd worn smooth. Stillness first, the bullet's just the end of it. She heard it the way you hear your own pulse. She'd built her whole self around it. 2 days before the Safed run, Corbin held court at the briefing board, and he did the thing he did. He'd pinned up a hand-drawn range card of the valley, distances and reference points marked in grease pencil, and he tapped it with 2 fingers like a professor. "This is how you read terrain," he told his section, loud, performing for the room. He did not say that the card was hers. She'd ranged every point on it the second week she arrived, on her own time, with her own optics, and handed it to the section sergeant without a word. Corbin had peeled her name off the corner. A private named Doss laughed at one of his jokes, and Corbin glowed. Captain Reuben Sayer stood at the back, arms folded, nodding. Sayer was not a cruel man. He was a tired one, a company commander with too many problems and a habit of looking at the loudest source of confidence in the room and deciding that was where competence lived. He used the range card. He praised the card. He never once asked who made it. That was his blind spot, and it was about to cost him more than he could imagine. A different kind of dismissal landed on Specialist Lena Park, and it landed alone, away from anything to do with Marin. Park was 23, a driver and a comms specialist, fast and bright, and too eager to be liked. During a brief, she pointed at the same corridor and said the valley acoustics would scatter radio in the throat of the pass, that they'd lose line-of-sight comms right where it mattered. Corbin waved her off without turning around. "Drive the truck, Park. Let the grown-ups talk." She sat back down with her ears red and her mouth shut. She was right. She would be proven right in about 36 hours, in the worst possible way. There was one more person who saw something, though he didn't know what he was seeing. The armorer, a kid named Tibbs, sat behind his half-door cleaning weapons and watched Marin zero her rifle one evening on the makeshift range. He noticed she did it differently. No wasted motion. She didn't yank the bolt or chase the target. She settled, went still as a stone in a creek, and the rifle seemed to go off almost by accident, 3 rounds stacking into one ragged hole at 300 meters. "Huh," Tibbs said, mostly to himself. "You do that different than the other guys." Marin cleared the weapon and handed it back without looking up. "Slower," she said. That was the whole conversation. He'd remember it later. Everyone would. The night before everything broke, Marin found Lena Park sitting on an ammo can behind the comms hut, frustrated, sketching the valley in a notebook by red light. "It scatters here," Park said, jabbing the page, not really expecting an answer. "The signal. Right in the throat. I can feel it, and I can't prove it." Marin sat down beside her. She didn't offer comfort. She offered the range card from memory, the real one, distances and dead zones, and the high shelf on the north wall, and she walked Park through how sound and signal both bent around the same rock. They worked for an hour, heads bent together. 2 people who were good at things nobody had asked them to be good at. Park learned to read wind off the dust. Marin learned that Park's instinct for the terrain was real, not lucky. At the end, Park grinned. "We should run this place." For 1 second, the faintest warmth moved behind Marin's eyes, the only time it would all night. "Drive the truck," she said, deadpan, and Park snorted so hard she nearly fell off the can. The Safed run left at 04. Corbin's section, 3 trucks, headlights off, climbing into the cold. Marin stayed behind, the rear medic, exactly where she'd been put. At 0622, the world tore open. It came across the radio first as noise, then as words that did not fit together. The lead truck hit a pressure plate in the throat of the pass, right where Park said comms would die, and the valley walls lit up with machine gun fire from the high shelf on the north wall, the shelf nobody had counted. 2 trucks pinned, one on its side. Casualties. The transmissions broke apart in the dead zone, exactly as a 23-year-old driver had promised they would, coming through in shredded pieces. A word, a scream of static. A word. In the operations hut, Captain Sayer stood over the radio with his hand pressed flat on the map and his face going gray. The grid Corbin's section needed cleared was a single firing position on the high north shelf, and it had pinned an entire patrol, and there was no air for 40 minutes, and no one at this outpost who could reach that shelf with accurate fire across the valley. No one. Sayer knew it. Everyone in the hut knew it. The silence in that room was its own kind of casualty. Marin was already standing in the doorway with the aid bag on one shoulder. She had heard enough. Sir. Just the one word. Sayer looked at her, and you could see it happen. The math arriving against everything he'd assumed. The range card he'd praised finally finding its author. The north shelf, she said, 740 meters from the spur above the LZ. I've got the dope. Give me the MK-13 and a vehicle, and I'll open the corridor. It cost him something to nod. It cost him a piece of the picture he'd carried for 11 weeks. Go, he said. Park drives. Out in the valley, pinned behind a dead truck with rounds walking across the hood, Corbin had the handset against his cheek, and he could not make himself say it. He'd run out of his own options. His section was bleeding. The only fire solution left was the woman he'd benched for laughs, and he knew it, and the knowing sat in his throat like a stone. The radio hissed. Sayer's voice came through the dead zone in fragments, telling him help was moving, telling him a name. And Corbin keyed the handset, and there was a silence on the net that lasted maybe 4 seconds, which in a firefight is a year. When he finally spoke, his voice was not loud. It had nothing left to perform with. Adler. A pause, the radio crackling, his breath audible under the word. Adler, if you can hear this, we need you on the north shelf. We can't. Static ate the rest. Then his voice came back smaller than anyone in his section had ever heard it. Please. The men around him, the ones who'd laughed, went still as the rock they were hiding behind. Doss stopped firing for a second and just looked at the handset. Nobody said anything. Something in all of them shifted at once, because the loudest man they knew had just begged the quietest woman they knew to come save their lives, and there was no joke big enough to cover that. Park drove like the truck was an extension of her own spine, headlights dark, climbing the spur above the landing zone, while rounds from the valley floor cracked overhead. They reached the high point at 0639. Marin was out before the wheels stopped, dragging the MK-13 and a half-dozen magazines of .300 Winchester Magnum across the rock, settling prone behind a saddle of stone, and the change in her was total. The woman who never spoke keyed her own radio, and her voice came across the net flat and clean and surgical, a different instrument entirely than the timid medic they'd labeled her. All stations, Safid. This is Adler on the spur. I have eyes on the north shelf. Ranging now. Keep your heads down for 90 seconds, and then I am going to give you a corridor. In the valley, behind his dead truck, Corbin heard that voice, and his head came up, because nothing about it matched the person he'd built in his mind. He keyed his own handset, and for the first time in 11 weeks, there was no swagger left in him, only a stunned, scrambling confusion. "Adler, that you? Say again. He stopped. He looked at the dead radio, at the shelf, at his bleeding men, and he understood in one terrible rush that the only thing standing between his section and the end of all of them was the woman he'd taught his soldiers to laugh at. "Copy," he said, and the word came out cracked. "Copy. You have control. We'll hold. Just keep talking to us." Trust, forced out of him by the only currency a firefight accepts, which is staying alive. His men heard him hand the entire fight to her, and not one of them said a word. 740 meters across the throat of the pass, the North Shelf. Wind 8 knots, quartering left to right, gusting in the cold dawn. Dust hanging in the air, thinning the light to gray. Marin built the firing solution, the way Pruitt had drilled into her 10,000 times, dialing the elevation, holding for the wind. And she went still. Stillness first. The machine gun crew was working from a notch in the rock. 2 men feeding and firing, a third spotting. The Mk-13 spoke, a deep, flat crack that rolled across the valley and slapped back off the south wall a half-second later. The gunner dropped over his weapon. The feeder turned to look, and she worked the bolt, a hard metallic snick clack against the wind, and fired again. He fell across the first man. The spotter ran and made it 4 steps, 3 down. The machine gun went silent, and the silence after it was its own announcement, traveling down the valley to every pinned soldier who'd been eating that fire for 15 minutes. She did not stop. A second position opened up from a cluster of rocks lower on the shelf. Riflemen. And she walked the bolt gun across them with a rhythm that was almost gentle. Fire. Cycle. Breathe. Fire. 4. 5. 6. Brass tinked off the stone beside her and rolled. 7. 8. 9. Each shot a flat heavy crack, and then the long rolling echo. Down in the valley, Doss lifted his head over the hood and watched the North Shelf come apart and whispered something that wasn't quite a prayer. 10. 11. 12. A fire team broke cover and tried to rush a stranded vehicle, 6 men in the open, and she took them in under 14 seconds, the bolt cycling so fast it sang. 13, 14, 15, 16, 17, 18. The corridor was opening. Corbin's section started to move wounded toward the lee of the rocks. Then the enemy got smart, and the enemy got lucky, and both at once. There was a marksman on that shelf, a real one. He'd been watching her muzzle blast lift dust off the spur, and he'd been patient. And now he answered. The first round came in high and to the left, and Marin felt it before she heard it. The pressure change of a near miss, snapping the air a hand's width above her skull. A sound like cloth tearing very fast. And then the crack of the rifle rolled in behind it. She did not flinch upward, which is the thing that gets people killed. She pressed flatter into the rock and made herself smaller, and her heart slammed once, hard, against the inside of her ribs. And then she made it slow down by force of will alone, the way she'd trained for years to do. A second round hit the stone 6 inches from her elbow and threw chips into her cheek, hot and sharp. And a third skipped off the saddle and screamed away into the valley with a long rising whine. He had her bracketed. She was a small woman, lying on bare rock at the top of a spur. With a man 700 meters away, who knew exactly where she was, and there was nowhere to go that wouldn't expose her more. And for 3 full seconds, the outcome of all of it was genuinely, horribly uncertain. Dust kicked into her eyes. She could not see his position. She could only see the bright wink of muzzle flash a half-second after each round arrived, and she started counting the gap between the flash and the crack, building his range in her head while his rounds chewed the rock around her. And the whole time, one voice held steady under the fear. Stillness first. The bullet's just the end of it. She heard Pruitt as plainly as if his hand were on her shoulder. She rolled left off the saddle as a round split the air where her head had been, came up behind a lower lip of stone, and got eyes back on the shelf. And that was when Lena Park changed the fight without being told to. Park had pulled the truck to a different angle to drag a casualty, and from there she could see what Marin couldn't. The marksman's hide tucked under an overhang on a higher rock. She keyed up, voice shaking but clear. "Adler, your shooter. He's up and right of your last, under the dark overhang, higher than you think. I've got his flash. Send it." A grid, a correction, the thing Marin needed and could not see for herself. An independent decision by a 23-year-old driver that bought back the entire fight. But Marin's count of good rounds for the MK-13 was down to the last magazine, and worse, far worse, was happening on the valley floor. A pair of fighters had flanked wide and were closing on a casualty stranded in the open between 2 trucks. A kid dragged halfway to cover and then dropped when his carry team got pinned. Marin keyed the net. "Sefid, who is the casualty in the open at the lead truck? Who is that? Send it." Static. She tried again. "Any station, identify the man in the open." Nothing came back but the hiss of the dead zone and the crackle of a fire she couldn't see. 3 seconds. 5, 7. The empty channel stretched out and filled the inside of her chest with something cold, because a man was lying in the open, and she did not know if he was breathing, and the radio would not tell her. Then a broken transmission, half a word, a younger voice, and a single readable phrase punched through the static. "Mott! It's Mott! He's still moving." And then the dead zone swallowed it again. So she made the choice that was not a sniper's choice. She could not be in 2 places, and the man in the open had seconds, not minutes. She left the long gun. She came up off the rock, slung the MK-13, drew her carbine, and went down the face of the spur into the valley on foot and in the open, and the sound of her war changed completely. The deep, rolling boom of the 300 traded for the sharp, flat bark of the M4 close to her own ears. Faster, lighter, a different animal. She covered ground no one should cover upright. Rounds kicked dust at her heels. A fighter rose from behind a rock 40 meters out, and she put 3 into him, on the move, without breaking stride. 19, and another at the corner of the lead truck. 20, and the whole time she was running toward the one place on the battlefield with no cover at all, the bare patch of gravel where a kid named Mott lay bleeding. She got between him and the flanking fighters, dropped to a knee over his body, and turned to face the 2 men closing from the wide rock. And for the second time that morning, the outcome of everything balanced on a knife. They were close, 30 meters, moving well, and she had a half-spent magazine and a wounded man under her, and open ground on every side, and no time to think, only to be still inside the noise. The first fighter fired and missed wide, and she did not. 21. The second was faster, better, and his round caught the meat of her left shoulder and spun her a quarter turn, a hammer blow, hot then cold, then nothing yet. And she finished the turn she'd been knocked into and used it, came back at him and fired, and he folded. 22. That left the marksman on the shelf, the patient one, the only enemy still in the fight, and he had a clear line on both of them now. Marin got back on the long gun, last round in the MK-13. 740 meters, uphill, the wind gusting harder in the rising light, her left shoulder pouring warmth down into her sleeve, and her hands wanting to shake. She pressed into the rock over Mott's body and went still, stiller than she had ever been, the kind of still that is almost like dying. And she put Park's correction onto the dark overhang and waited for the wind to take a breath. Pruitt's voice. Stillness first. The wind dropped. The bullets just the end of it. She broke the shot. A full second of nothing, the round in flight across the whole width of the valley, and then a puff of dust under the overhang and a rifle tumbling off the rock to clatter down the shelf. 23. The valley went quiet, except for the wind and the small fires and the ringing in everyone's ears. The specific silence of a firing position, going dark for good. Marin keyed the net one last time, her voice flat against all of it. All stations, Cepheid. North shelf is clear. Corridor is open. Engagement complete. She had been on that spur for 11 minutes. And then the warrior put the rifle down, and the healer took her place, in the same body, with the same hands. Marin rolled off the long gun, ignored the cold spreading through her own shoulder, and turned to the kid, bleeding into the gravel beneath her. She slung the rifle across her back and opened the aid bag, and the hands that had just sent a round across 700 meters of valley became something entirely different, quick and soft and sure. Private First Class Caleb Mott, 19 years old, a round through the upper thigh, dark blood, but not the bright pulsing kind, which was the first thing she checked and the first small mercy. She packed the wound with gauze and got a tourniquet high and tight on the leg, and talked the whole time in a low, even voice. Not because the words mattered, but because the sound of a calm voice keeps a scared kid's heart from running away from him. Look at me, Mott. Eyes here. What's your sister's name? His lips were going gray. Becca, he managed. She's 12. I'm supposed to... His breath hitched. I'm supposed to teach her to ride a motorcycle when I get home. Gonna open a shop. Bikes. His hand found her sleeve and gripped it, and his eyes were enormous and wet and young, and he asked her the only question that was left in him. Am I dying? Tell me the truth. Am I dying? Marin did not look away. She did not hedge. She pressed her palm flat against the dressing and met his eyes and gave him the only answer she ever gave to that question. Short, certain, a fact, and not a comfort. No, not today. She said it the way Pruitt used to say, his one true thing, like it was already finished. You're going home. You're teaching Becca to ride. I've got you. And the kid believed her, because there are people who say things, and people who make things true, and he could feel, even half gone, which kind she was. She got fluids going. She held pressure with her ruined shoulders screaming, and her good hand steady. When the medevac finally beat in over the south wall, 31 minutes later, Caleb Mott was still gripping her sleeve, still breathing, still arguing weakly about motorcycle brands. The promise held. The promise would always hold. 2 days later, the convoy came back down off the mountain for the last time, and the motor pool looked exactly as it had the morning Wade Corbin pulled her off the manifest. Same gravel, same cold wind off the ridge, same generator coughing in the corner. But everything inside that horseshoe of barriers had changed, and you could feel it in the way men stepped aside when Maren Adler walked through, her left arm in a sling, the aid bag still on her good shoulder, because she would not let anyone carry it for her. Corbin was waiting by the same spot where he'd held the clipboard. He was not holding anything now. His hands hung at his sides like they didn't know what they were for. The whole section had drifted in close, the ones who had laughed, drawn by something they couldn't name. And Captain Sayre stood at the edge of it, the way he always stood at the edge of things. Corbin's jaw worked. He started to speak and stopped, swallowed, started again, and the first sound that came out was nothing at all. The loud was gone. Whatever he'd used to fill a room had drained out of him on that valley floor. "I had you wrong," he finally said, and his voice cracked on the last word, and he had to stop and breathe before he could go on. "Not," he pressed the heel of his hand against his eye, "not just on the manifest, not just tactically. I had you wrong about who you were. I built a whole story about you out of nothing because it was easier than looking. I peeled your name off that card. I made the boys laugh at you to feel bigger." His shoulders, which had always been thrown back, came forward and down, and in front of every man who had ever heard him mock her, he stood there smaller than any of them, his eyes red, his hands shaking. "You came when I begged you. After all of it, you came." He didn't ask her to forgive him. He had the decency not to. He just stood in the wreckage of the man he used to be and let everyone see it. Maren looked at him for a long moment. She was quiet for exactly 4 seconds. Then she gave him 2 words, no warmth and no ice in them, just the flat truth that asked nothing and granted nothing. "I know." That was all, and somehow it was enough to finish him and free him at the same time. Sayre waited until the others had drifted back, and then he found Maren alone by the armorer's hut. And what happened there was separate, and it was harder, because a man does not easily admit that his blindness was a system and not a slip. He didn't start with words. He stood looking at the wall map of the Safid corridor, the range card still pinned to it, and you could watch him arrive at something in real time, the muscles in his face working through it. He closed his eyes. He pulled an ammo can over and sat down on it deliberately so that he was below her eye level, a company commander putting himself beneath a sergeant on purpose, and only then did he look up at her. 11 weeks, he said quietly. "I used your card every day. I praised the man who handed it to me. I heard him talk over Park, and I let it ride because he was loud, and loud felt like sure." He shook his head slowly. "This isn't on Corbin. Not only. I'm the one who set the table. This is on all of us, and it starts with me." He was quiet a moment, gathering it. Then he gave her the thing that mattered. 3 words, no more, soldier to soldier, carrying the full weight of everything he'd failed to see. "You were always one of us." Then he stood, and he made it real the only way that counts, with an action and not a feeling. "You're running the marksmanship and the Valley Overwatch for this company from today. Park works comms and terrain at your side, by name, on the order. I'll have it in writing by tonight." Words become true when behavior changes. He changed the behavior. The proof that Corbin had actually changed came a week later, And it came when no one expected it, and Marin wasn't even in the room. A replacement showed up, a cocky private fresh off the bird, and he saw the small woman crossing the LZ with her sling and her aid bag, and he said the kind of thing the old Corbin would have started. That the medic? Little thing. They let her carry a rifle up here. The men around him went quiet, waiting, and Corbin turned around slow. He didn't raise his voice. He'd learned that the loudest voice is almost never the one worth listening to. He stepped close to the private and spoke low and level, so the kid had to lean in to hear it. That woman cleared a firing position at 740 meters in a crosswind with a round in her shoulder, on foot, in the open, to keep 9 of us breathing, and one of the 9 was me. He let that sit. You will learn her name before you learn anyone else's on this outpost. You will get your gear inspected by her, and you will say thank you when she's done. And the next time you measure somebody by their size, you remember that the quietest person in the room is usually the one who's already done the math on how to save your life. He walked off. The private learned her name that afternoon. Corbin made sure of it, and he kept making sure of it every day in a dozen small ways, which is the only proof of change that has ever meant anything. The armorer, Tibbs, was there when the medevac records came back, confirming Mott would keep the leg and walk again, and he stood in his half door watching Marin clean the MK-13, the same slow way she cleaned everything, no wasted motion, still as a stone in a creek. He thought about the evening he'd watched her zero a rifle and said, "You'd do that different." He understood now what he'd been looking at and hadn't had the words for. A young soldier asked him what really happened up on the spur, and Tibbs didn't reach for anything fancy. He just looked across the gravel at the small woman with the sling and the aid bag and said the truest and simplest thing there was. She saved all of us. Every one of us that came home, she's the reason. Then he went back to his rifles, because some things you only need to say once. That night, Marin found Lena Park behind the comms hut again, on the same ammo can, and this time, Park wasn't sketching. She was shaking, the delayed kind that comes after, the kind that waits until the danger's over to arrive. "I keep hearing it," Park said, not looking up. "The static, trying to reach you and not knowing. Mott in the open." Her voice broke. "I gave you that grid, and my hands were shaking so bad I almost couldn't key the radio." Marin sat down beside her, the way she had before, and she didn't tell her it was fine, and she didn't tell her she'd done good, because Park already knew both of those things and didn't need them said. She just sat there, a steady weight in the dark, present, while a brave young woman let her body finish being afraid. After a while, she said one thing, quiet, the thing she most believed. "The grid you gave me is the only reason I'm alive. You were right about the comms. You were right about the valley. You were right the whole time, and they'll know it now." Park leaned her head on Marin's good shoulder and breathed, and the shaking eased, and the mountains stood up dark and silent around the little outpost the way they always had, indifferent witnesses to whatever small human thing was finishing below them. Marin didn't feel triumphant. That was the thing the men who'd laughed could never have understood about her, that there was no victory in any of it for her, no scoreboard, no vindication she'd been waiting to collect. What settled into her in the days after was not pride and not anger finally answered. something quieter than that, and far more durable. The simple, level peace of a person who had been exactly who she was when it mattered most, who had not needed the room to believe in her in order to do the thing the room could not do. She had carried Pruitt's voice up that spur and brought it back down again, and that was the only argument she had ever needed to win. 3 weeks later, a bird came in to rotate the company down off the mountain, and Marin walked toward it, across the same gravel, aid bag on her shoulder, sling gone now, moving toward whatever came next. Corbin fell in beside her for a few steps, not crowding, just there. He didn't make a speech. He'd learned that too. He just put out his hand, and she took it. And the handshake lasted 1 full second longer than a handshake needs to. The distance between two people closing in the space of a held grip. Adler, he said. Just her name, but he said it the way you say the name of someone you respect, which was a country away from how he'd said it that first cold morning. She met his eyes, level, calm, no triumph and no grudge in them. Only the steady quiet of someone who had nothing left to prove, and never really had. "Corbin," she said. Then she let go and turned, and walked into the wind toward the aircraft. And she did not look back, because she had never once needed them to watch her to know exactly who she was.